start talking about political feasibility. This is an idea which can be used and it can attract a lot of people. We know specifically because we are trying to replicate Umoja and a Hispanic organization in Puerto Rico, at least in part, around the country now. And we, as part of the replication, match money locally, and the local money invariably is by conservative corporations. And we have to talk them into it. And often the conservative corporations don't know what to make of the House of Umoja until they see Ronald Reagan praising it. And so I'm really talking about some of the practical politics behind an idea which I think has a lot of substantive viability. Actually, one of our programs is in Boston. Dan Jaffe, the head of Dorchester Youth Collaborative, is in the audience. Good to see you, Dan. I don't want to take any more time now, just about a minute and a half more. I hope in the course of the evening, in the minutes we have left today, this evening, that we can review the many other complex issues that I've only suggested here. And those issues, for example, include exactly how extended families can be created, exactly how employment can work to reduce crime by those employed. Terrible, huge debates on that, as most of you know. Exactly how the concepts of deterrence and incapacitation have their own limitations. And here, of course, we have the excellent book by Mark Moore and his colleagues, which has just come out, and we have fine grounds for discussing that issue. How crime prevention means very different things these days if you're talking about the white suburbs and the black inner city. And finally, how minority neighborhood organizations with a stake in their own turf need to take the lead in organizing against crime. I think in many or most situations, if a neighborhood organization is strong, it ought to be in the forefront, and the police ought to assist that organization rather than the police being in the forefront assisted by community groups. Now, I say that on purpose because I know that Mr. Williams was interested in this, and we've already talked on the phone, and I hope that perhaps in our discussions later we can talk about the relative roles of community groups and the police, because this is an important emerging area in which we, I think, do have to have more debate and do have to have more experimentation. I want to conclude simply by reading from a few lines of the book. Even with the experience and empirical findings that support it, the potential of neighborhood, family, and employment as a national policy of crime prevention integrated with a policy to reduce the underclass will be resisted by those who are unable or unwilling to move beyond preconceptions and face the limitations of deterrence and incapacitation. Those who say that the relationship between unemployment and crime is too complex to unite labor market policy and crime prevention policy cannot be paying attention to Robert Taggart's studies of federal programs and the Vera and Rand studies funded by the federal government. Those who say that they have never seen the causes of crime and that we cannot create effective extended family programs have not seen the Argus community in the Bronx, the House of Umoja, and evaluations by the U.S. General Accounting Office. Those who believe that police, rather than community organizations, must invariably control neighborhood-based crime prevention appear uninformed of El Centro's good relations with the police and of the cost-effective results that Charles Silberman suggests can accrue from integrating community regeneration, economic development, and crime prevention. With that, I'll stop talking. I'd now like to introduce Sister Falaka Fatah, who is here with her husband, David. They are the co-founders of the House of Umoja Boys Town in Philadelphia, and they can tell you what it's really like on the streets. Sister Fatah.
Well, I can tell you what it's like in the house. Dave can tell you what it's like in the street. Well, first, Dean Allison, we do have a Harvard connection. Our son's state representative, Shaka Fatah, was here on a scholarship last summer. And you have a special program for politicians. And so, okay. So you had the son, now you have the parents. Okay. The House of Umoja, if anyone had told me it would be equally supported by liberals and conservatives, quotes, I never would have believed it. It was not our intention, really, at the offset to be supported by anyone per se, except we were very concerned about the fact that my 16-year-old son, and I have 6 boys, had joined a gang. And at the time that he, at least at the time that I found out that he was in a gang, was the same time when the commissions were issuing their reports. I'm talking about 1969. At that time, I was a journalist and working on a story about gangs. And you know, as men are apt to do, my husband had told me so many times about his great adventures in the street when he was out there a generation previously. I leaned on him and asked him to do some research in places where I could not go. Places such as bars and pool rooms and on the corners and what have you. So the summer of '69, he spent his time staying out late, boozing with the fellas, and if I said anything, he said, well, honey, you know, you asked me to do the research. Nevertheless, after 3 months of this type of activity, he did begin to assemble a report. And in his report, he traced the migration patterns of black people from the South to Philadelphia. And he found that people had a tendency to settle in different sections of Philadelphia. For instance, what other people looked at and just simply called the black community, they weren't aware that folks from Florida were in one section, and people from Georgia were in another section, and people from Virginia were in another section, and that not only were these people from different parts of the South, but that there were distinct cultures that had been created in their homes, in their home state, and not only that, that there were different classes within the black community. People still don't understand that really, but nevertheless, that as with many immigrant families coming to America, first it was a matter of the male coming to the North, and after a period of time getting himself situated with a place to live and a job, he would in time send money back home for his wife and for his children. In order to make the initial steps in the urban setting, what the male would do would be look for someone from home, a homeboy. In street language, this you find among gangs is the homie. And what does the homie do? He tells him where to go to get the job. He also takes up for him if there's a dispute. Normal. But this was also the beginning of some of the most fierce gangs in Philadelphia, because when some of these disputes would become a confrontation, going from the verbal to the physical confrontation, it was the homie who quite often turned out to be the one that had the knife or had the gun. It also turned out that, and many times when someone was killed, it was during the funeral rituals where plots were hatched to get even for the person who had been killed. So that what was, I would think, the normal course in human relations took a negative turn. You found that in time in Philadelphia, you had sections where within the boundaries of people from Virginia, people from Georgia, etc., they had begun to carve up Philadelphia into turf boundaries. And also that the numbers of deaths had escalated because of technology, basically. Those people who originally were looking for a fair one, which meant basically settling disputes with their fists, because of the changes that had taken place in the larger community, began to settle it with knives and then graduated to selling it with guns. Well, a person might be able to survive a good fight, but you cannot as easily survive a 38 bullet. And so this was why the deaths increased to the point where 19 '69 was labeled the year of the gun, and Philadelphia had the dubious distinction of being the gang capital of the United States. When my husband began to bring all of this information back to me, I simply continued working on other stories which I found more interesting. I really didn't think that gang activity had that much interest in my life personally or professionally. However, one night he came home and told me that he had found out that our 16-year-old was a member of a gang, had been in a gang a long time, and was in fact in the leadership of one of the gangs. And then I think whatever professionalism that I brought to this particular issue went immediately out of the window, and all of this maternalism came flooding in. And of course, the incarceration rates, the number of young people who were in wheelchairs, the number who were blind, the numbers who were unable to go to school on a regular basis, all of this became translated into my son. When I further investigated and found out that his gang was in fact in a state of war with two other gangs, and if I added up the numbers of the membership of those two other gangs, it came up to 250 young people in Philadelphia who would have thought it a tremendous trophy to kill my son. I just stopped sleeping very well. I became obsessed with the subject. I wanted to know who was doing what and why. And I found out in short order that there were many well-meaning people who were trying to do something, but nothing was really working. And that is the origin of the program that you saw depicted. And that has been 600 boys ago. It is not a panacea. It does not work for everyone. And the idea of the Boys Town is basically a response to the needs that we have found among these 600 youth.
Thank you, Sister Falaka. Next speaker is Hubert Williams, who is Director of Police of the Newark Police Department and the designated new president of the Police Foundation.
Thank you. I'd like to first commend Sister Fatah and her husband and family for creating a family for so many of the youth in Philadelphia. I can recall a time in American life when there was far less crime and far less violence and far more stability in the American family situation. And perhaps if there is a message in the experience that we're seeing growing out of the work that they're doing, it is that a comprehensive program to some degree can begin to emulate a family life, an extended family that they've created for the youth there. When we look back, as the Eisenhower Commission has done, through the years at the approach that we've taken in the society to dealing with crime, an awful lot of money was poured in to the criminal justice system, and a lot of things occurred. Some of these things that occurred may not go directly to the crime problem. The equation is not known. All we do know is some ingredients. We can't tell why crime has escalated so much through the years, and nor do we know with any degree of certainty why crime has suddenly started to go down over the last few years. And we can only theorize as to the reasons why, in spite of the dramatic reductions that we're beginning to see, the levels of fear remain so high. But over the last decade or so, the monies that we've poured into police institutions has fostered considerable change. Police have become more open, more educated. 15 years ago, there were not many police officers that was concerned about their education, going to college. One of the programs that was instituted was the LEAP program, the Law Enforcement Educational Program, that dramatically changed the way police officers saw themselves and saw their educational needs. As a result of that, or in part as a result of that, police departments became more open to change. A lot of the things that police have believed through the years have been myths growing out of the traditions, out of the experiences of the various departments. The empirical work that's been done throughout this country in policing has demonstrated that a lot of the practices, the methodology used by police departments simply have not worked. And we've seen police departments change their procedures as a result of the research that's been done. We thought at one point, as Lynn has pointed out, that police marked patrol units constituted a visible form of deterrence and security for neighborhoods. We learned out of the Kansas City studies conducted by Dr. George Kelling on behalf of the Police Foundation that that didn't work. In Newark, we learned that foot patrol didn't work. It did not work to prevent crime, and neither did it work to deter crime. But a peculiar sort of enigma came out of that. People felt more secure. And we raised the question as to why people could feel more secure in spite of the fact that the particular strategy that was being used did not prevent or reduce crime. And that is now, that now constitutes the area which is perhaps at the cutting edge of the focus of police research in this country today, this whole question of fear and why the fear levels are so high. One of the problems I think that we've had in focusing so much on the criminal justice system is we've taken a rather narrow view of the criminal justice system. We've seen the criminal justice system as beginning with the police and encompassing the courts and the correctional institutions. We have never seen the criminal justice system as an extended system linking into a network of community that forms the base of the system itself. Now, before we developed our system of policing as we know it today in this country, there was a system in England where the people themselves provided the police services. And there was a variety of groups formed in those days that gained national reputations, Watch and Ward, the Bow Street Runners, other groups of citizens, because of their astute skills and manners in handling criminals, they gained reputation. But that was changed. It was changed because it did not work effective. In 1869, Sir Robert Peel introduced legislation into the Parliament in England that would change the way the system of policing worked and more closely emulate what we have today. Police became institutionalized, and to some degree the public saw their responsibilities as being relinquished as a result of the institutionalization of police. But the precepts were very, very similar to the old way in which police procedures were operationalized. Peel said that the police and community must be one. And throughout time, as the textbooks have been written in this country, the same sort of concepts emerge, that you must really have a police and community as a single entity. We don't have that in this country today. Police, through the years, have seen themselves as separated from community. Only in the last 6 to 8 years have we seen police begin to change their views and their perspectives regarding the public and the role and responsibility that the public has with respect to the policing of community. Police, perhaps because of the economic situation, the erosion fiscally occurring within the cities, began to look towards community as a resource and have developed a whole series and variety of programs aimed at getting community involved in the policing function. I think that it would be a mistake to focus narrowly today and look at community as a panacea without recognizing the bridge that links the two together, which I believe is a critical factor, a sense of unity between a community and those institutions that provide for the services. I don't think, and Lynn raised a point earlier, and I will comment on it briefly, that neighborhood groups should be in the forefront, and the police should provide the support. Well, to the degree that we can make that happen, that would be great. But we should not pay $1 billion a year for a budget for the New York City Police Department and tell the citizens that pay those taxes that they have to be up front. There's a role, there's a responsibility for people that should be one in which they're not required to face the dangers and hazards associated with patrolling and policing of the streets. Their role and their responsibilities must be to provide the support system necessary to aid and assist the police in accomplishing the missions which we charge them to do. There's no reason why people should put themselves in jeopardy. One of the problems that we have, and I'll end on this comment, is that we have about 2.6 police officers per 1,000 people in America. Obviously, police cannot be everywhere. The system implies a need for support, a need to provide information, a need to meet civic duties and responsibilities with respect to testifying in court and things of that nature. The public cannot relinquish its responsibility by virtue of the fact that it has an organized police department. We can look at a role for citizens, critical, vital role that they must play, and we can shape and reform the policing institutions so that it functions in concert with a community's sense of values. But we cannot allow the police to relinquish their duties or responsibilities and transform those into a public that is neither ready, prepared, nor trained to discharge the duties that police are required by law to perform. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Williams. That's some interesting issues to debate, I think, there. Our last speaker is going to be speaking more on group disorder. We've been talking about individual crime. David Ginsburg is a private attorney in Washington and is former, among other things, former executive director of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder, or the Kerner Riot Commission, as it was called in 1968 when a number of cities were burning. David?
Thank you, Lynn. Well, first, I've listened with interest to Sister Fatah, and all I can say about that is that it would be a marvelous thing if we can replicate her. And except by cloning, I just have no suggestion, and that I see as the problem. And Mr. Williams, in listening to him, you've heard really one of the best that this country can produce. And I believe that what he said, deeply felt, but I'm not at all sure that it reflects the viewpoint of the police of the country as a whole. I recall that in the early riot days, we were deeply concerned about the attitude of the police, and remember all the problems with the citizens review boards having to do with police activities. So that this represents what can be for the future. It really doesn't represent, I think, what has existed for the past. But my job is not to comment on what has been said or indeed on the problems of crime, except collective violence. And that's only one chapter, chapter 7 out of this new volume that's been published, and that's the one that's interested me most. It's called The Redress of Grievance and Public Policy, written by Sandra Ball Rokich and James B. Short. Lynn said that there were 3 commissions in the 60s, and he spoke first of the Katzenbach Commission. That was really in 1965 when it was organized, and that was a response to Barry Goldwater. That was the campaign of 64, Goldwater and Johnson, and law and order then became an issue. And Johnson responded by establishing a commission with Attorney General Katzenbach at its head. A marvelous man, Dr. Kenneth Clark, when he came before us at a later date, I remember in the Indian Treaty Room on the top floor of the Army, Navy, and State building, that's now the Executive Office Building number 1. And we were there in the Indian Treaty Room, and there was Kenneth Clark, a small, rather wizened, cynical, hard-bitten type. And he recalled all the work of the past commissions, the commissions on the riots in Harlem and the riots elsewhere that had taken place. And he said it was like an Alice in Wonderland, and that all these commissions made essentially the same analyses and the same recommendations, and they were all followed by the same inaction. And I remember the commissioners stood there and they were shocked because what were they there for? Well, Katzenbach did a good job. It was a first-rate report, I thought, and he broke with the past. It was basically concerned with individual crime, but Katzenbach pushed the report to the point that he began to focus not on the psychological defects of the criminal, but the problems that existed within our society and within our economy. That was the first time. In all the reports that Kenneth Clark had referred to, there was nothing of that sort before. Then we came along in 1967. This was the Kerner Commission. Otto Kerner. Why was he? He was the governor of the state of Illinois, and I wondered why he had been appointed chairman of the commission. And I ultimately found out. Because he had done more to bring blacks into the National Guard than any other governor in the country. And the National Guard of Illinois had something like 2.5% black, and that was the largest percentage in the country. It was one of the perks of being white, the ability to get into the National Guard, and Johnson felt, let's recognize that. That's how he came into it. Well, throughout 67, I remember I went off that summer with the family, went west, but I kept reading about what was happening, especially in New Jersey and in Detroit. Detroit exploded suddenly with riots, and then it was, I think, Mr. Williams, in the first 2 weeks of July, when suddenly exploded again. And this time it was in Newark, and it wasn't only in Newark. It was in Newark, and it was in Plainfield, and it was all over northern New Jersey. And there it was. The country seemed to be falling apart. I was with the family at that time in Seattle, and I remember the phone rang. At the other end was LBJ. The White House was calling. Very important, come back right away. And so I got the family down to Portland, put them on the Salmon River boat trip, and I flew back to Washington. Came in the next day. I remember it was the last day of July, and he was establishing a new commission. Well, throughout that period, the last 2 weeks of July, it was burn, baby, burn. And that was Newark, and that was Detroit, in the surrounding communities. And in that year, it wasn't just a few. It was 150 communities in this country that exploded. Not all of them with the explosive quality of Newark and Detroit, but there were burns and burning, there was arson, and there was murder throughout the country. And it was frightening. Now, our commission worked for 8 months. We were given a year within which to report. And I remember that sitting with my deputy, Victor Palmieri, we decided that we couldn't wait a year because the next summer, apparently riots take place mostly in the summertime. I learned 2 things in this commission. One is riots take place in hot weather, and the other is the rich don't riot. Well, Johnson gave us every support. He really wanted something done. We ultimately ended up with about 200 people. We spent some $6 million. And the conclusion of what was essentially really a middle-class commission. And, you know, the phrase resounds still in my ears. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And this middle-class commission with Otto Kerner, and there we had John Lindsay and Senator Harris. He was a Democrat from Oklahoma, remained in the Senate one term. Ed Brooke, Senator Brooke of Massachusetts. Good Congressman Corman from L.A., Los Angeles. And Bill McCulloch, marvelous older man from Ohio. Then we had I.W. Abel, steelworkers, head of the steelworkers on it. Charles Thornton of Litton Industries, Roy Wilkins. And Roy was marvelous. So all of us sat at his feet as he recounted a lot of black history for that commission. And there were others, including Herbert Jenkins of Atlanta. We didn't have Stokely Carmichael on the commission, and we were criticized. Stokely is now, I learned just the other day from the Wall Street Journal, is running a grocery store on the eastern shore of Maryland. Didn't have Floyd McKissick, and didn't have James Baldwin on it. And the reason was, and this was Johnson's all the way through, he wanted to make sure that this was a middle-class commission, that they were going to report what they saw and not respond to any ideologies of any sort. Well, we went through 23 cities. We studied them carefully. Teams, detailed, temperatures, humidity, what actually the precipitating event of every one of these damned riots. Newark, Detroit, northern New Jersey, Plainfield, New Brunswick, Atlanta, Cincinnati. I remember going to Cincinnati with Kerner and with the mayor of New York. We walked through a line of big black men, and I was never so scared in my life, and they were spitting at us. And this was in the basement of a church. And we sat there talking about the problems of Cincinnati. Well, one problem with Cincinnati is that no black had ever gotten into the city government, because it was all at large in the city council, not by wards so that the blacks could make their political power felt, but just all at large. And the result was that they had never had any access to city power. Well, we came out that in every one of the cities that we studied, there were 24 riots in 23 cities. One of them had 2. First, we found discriminatory and ineffective police practices in every one of them. We found horrendous numbers of unemployed and underemployment, every one of them. We found horrible housing, and we found unacceptable educational and recreational programs. So, our conclusion was that without racism, just white racism, it couldn't have happened. And so we concluded that it was white racism that ensures that non-whites will be denied equal participation in American life and equal access to its material rewards. We had a long set of recommendations, and I remember we worked months on the first. This was the problem of police-community relations, police tactics and police-community relations. And what we did was to bring the chiefs of police and the heads of the fire departments and the mayor from 120 cities to Washington. There were, I don't know, over a period of 2 or 3 months, we used the FBI resources, brought teachers, spoke with them ourselves, and ultimately developed the chapters in the report having to do with police tactics in the event of riot and the problem, dealing with the problem of police-community relations. Well, we had recommendations having to do with enabling the ghetto residents to communicate their grievances to the cities and to their governors, to improve the criminal justice system. We were concerned about the media. They'd get into a riot area or a troubled area, the lights, and the police too, lights circling around, cameras coming out, and then the act would be put on for the television. And of course, we made many recommendations in the national area. All of the commissions did, having to do with education, with housing, and above all with jobs. Lynn, you spoke of neighborhood, and you spoke of family, but there's the other leg of the triad, this triad, is jobs. It's employment, without which I don't believe there are two core issues in my view. One is racism, and the other is jobs. If you can deal with these two, we will deal essentially with the problem, at least, of collective violence. Well, then came, we reported on March 1, 1968. Tet had happened, taken place just 3 months before, early in January. And 30 days after we reported, and not because of it, Johnson withdrew from the race. It was a time of great turmoil, great political turmoil. And then, shortly thereafter, in June, Bob Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. And then it was that, at least I saw for the first time, a city in flames. That was Washington. And it was burning in 14th Street and 9th Street and 8th Street Northeast and throughout. And you can see the ashes in the places still. Well, it was at that point that the Eisenhower Commission was appointed. This was, and then again, this was still Johnson. And he was concerned, why had there been so much violence as a consequence of Vietnam on the college campuses and at the DNC convention in '68 and at the counter-inaugural demonstration in Washington. And then he asked for a special report on what had happened in Cleveland. A horrible situation. And then as to the causes of all of this, Johnson was convinced, obsessed. I remember being called into the Oval Office. You've got to find out the sources of this conspiracy. We had given to us on our commission all of the resources of the FBI and the CIA, and there was no conspiracy. I remember Johnson insisted on a letter from J. Edgar Hoover that certifying, in his opinion, that there was no conspiracy, because he was absolutely convinced that it couldn't have exploded in 150 cities in a single year without some communication, some people talking to each other and organizing it. But it wasn't true. Well, the Eisenhower Commission had a marvelous report, basically designed to do three things. What do you do about the control of disorder when it happens? How do you keep open the channels of protest so that grievances can be expressed? And then a large number of recommendations having to do with the correction of the social injustices. Well, what, in a sense, worries me, we've seen now basically a sudden cessation of violence. And the mystery, so far as I'm concerned, is why. Why were the conditions as they are now, as you've described them in Philadelphia and as you've seen them in New York, in Newark, and as I've seen them in Washington, why with these conditions has there been this cessation of violence? Not crime. Crime may have reduced, I'm not so sure of that. But riots, except for Miami in '80 and '83, which are exceptions, we've had none in this since the '60s, throughout the '70s and into the '80s. Well, all sorts of reasons being given. One, better police training, better equipment on the part of police, and the cost of riots to the rioters has been increased. I remember going to a convention in St. Louis. This was during the period when we were preparing the report, there was those who manufactured equipment for the police had an exhibition. My God, there were tanks, there were the gas, there were these damn Stoner rifles. You know, a bullet will go through 8 inches of any wall, and people were buying them. Well, so there's an increased cost now to rioting. There's another factor. If the blacks look around to what the consequences of the riots, they find, as all of us have found, that the damage was largely done in the black areas. They were the ones, those areas were the ones that were destroyed. Then there's something more subtle. Rioting took place under Johnson at a time when it was a time of rising expectations. And not only that, of very considerable resources being thrown into the enrichment of the ghetto with the Great Society programs. This is a period of declining expectations and reducing resources. Then there's still another theory. You spoke, Lynn, of the underclass, of a black underclass. Basically, it's not only black now, it's all to a substantial degree Hispanic. This is a period of diminished hope, of ugliness from which there is no escape. No hope, no escape, what we call anomie. And in a sense, violence expresses still the hope that there can be change. But when there is no violence, there is no hope, and of course, no change. Now, I've been interested in still another one, number 5 for me, and that is the progress that's been made in the political field. We have so many black mayors now around the country. Philadelphia, in Newark, Gibson is there, Chicago, Los Angeles, and then throughout the South and in many other communities, we have an increased number of black officials. At the time we reported, there were about 100. Today, there's something closer to 2,500. That's been better. Now, I spoke before, and I'll finish with this, of the riots, of the unexpected riots in Miami. I went down there, worked with the police and with others. In 1980, 4 police officers were charged with basically beating to death a black businessman. They were tried, and they were not convicted, and the black community erupted. But the black community at that time was something different than it had been. In the 40s, as I was explaining to Dean Allison before, Miami, which was a new city, really started after World War I in the 20s, there had been an immense effort to clean up the city, and the bulldozer had gone through, and the black community had been almost obliterated, never recovered from it. So then later, the Cubans and the Caribbeans began to come into the city. Tourism shifted, changed, and a great many started coming in from South America and Central America. Spanish speaking, hard to get jobs unless you could also speak Spanish. And the black community was isolated, and the black community was impotent. One could understand what happened in 80. 83, a young Hispanic officer killed a young black, and again, the city erupted. This is just a mile from downtown Miami. So there is, here at the school, the thought has been expressed by a fellow named David Whitman. I don't know him, but I've read some of his work. That he's advanced a thesis that the black community in Miami had by now been transformed into a permanent class of unemployables. Now, we've known before of the difficulties and the aggravations, the heat and the impossibility of living in the ghetto. But at least it was occasionally possible to find jobs. And now with the kind of economy we're developing, the service economy and with the information economy, fewer and fewer jobs are available. In Miami, there were almost none. So that we're faced with a question which he raises, whether in a sense Miami was a continuation of the kind of rioting we had in '68, or whether it was something new and a precursor of the '90s. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that historical review that really weaves in and out between, I think, group violence and individual violence. If as I hear you right, you're also suggesting that crime can be a form of slow rioting. We're done with our presentations. We're behind schedule. Apologize again for starting late. We would like to take questions from the audience. If you have some, it's 9:25. I doubt it will take 45 minutes worth of questions, but we'd like to have you ask questions. If you raise your hand and when I call on you, come to the microphone, please, because this is all being recorded and we need you to do so. Questions, and direct your question to a specific person, please.
Thank you. For Mr. Williams, I was just saying to a friend tonight, I come from New York originally, I was just telling a friend tonight, well, maybe some things in New York could be improved, such as more housing for more people, for example, but still, I'm not so sure about the crime. There's something in the climate, but even here in Boston and New York to an even greater degree, that would give me some doubt about much improvement there. Do you think that some of the crime here and in New York and in some of the largest cities in the country is due to a certain kind of pathological atmosphere among some of the residents of that city, and that real ugliness in the, I don't know, the public mood there, and that even if there were amelioration in some issues of jobs or housing or discrimination, for example, that we might still see this violence as an expression of the urban malaise or almost urban, whatever one would say, craziness or a pathology of the city?
I'm going to try to respond to that. I'm not certain I understand. Let me make a couple of comments. One is that crime does not go up or down in one city as a rule. What we see is national trends occurring throughout all cities. Crime is going down throughout all of the cities virtually in America. New York's problem is that New York is a big city. So whatever difficulties the smaller cities may have, it's compounded in New York because it's so large. And it's so large, it's so difficult to govern. It has so much despair and poverty and so much hopelessness amongst so many people. Another problem that we didn't address is the inability of America to deal with the drugs. That has now become endemic to our culture. And the drugs feeds the violence because people have to get the narcotics, and they use crime as a means of gaining the revenue to deal with the drug problem. In New York, you have that subway situation, which isolates people into little cans, big cans, and sense of loneliness. I don't know all of the social, psychological phenomena that makes New York unique, but I do think that the size of the city has an awful lot to do with the complexity of the problems. But you shouldn't think that New York is substantially different from any other city beyond the size factor.
But do you think there's something in the urban climate that steers people toward crime as a way toward resolving problems, or as a way of thinking they can get away with it since there's they see immorality or they feel despair or something like that?
One of the problems is the Hayedo point, the class difference. You can't have islands of affluence amidst a sea of despair and hopelessness. When you do, you can anticipate that there's going to be problems. And that's precisely what you have in some of our cities. And New York is a good example of that.
I might also add, from at least my personal opinion, the media has a lot to do with this. The cases that are brought to the public's attention are these crazy cases, and the ones where you might use the word pathological. But the typical case, you never hear about, that they're going on all the time, and it just doesn't make good news at 11 o'clock. Next question.
Thank you. I'm Paul Hoare. Sister Fatah, does the name Umoja have any special significance? And President Curtis, you speak of a bubble-up community strategy. I wonder if you could tell me what that means.
Umoja is a Swahili word and means unity. Okay, and we chose that name because the House of Umoja came out of the Third Black Power Conference. These conferences followed the riots in Newark, and the first Black Power Conference was in Washington, the second was in Newark, the third was in Philadelphia in '68. And the theme of that conference was Umoja. And the representatives that came to that conference felt that unity in the black community was the most important requisite if we were going to be not become extinct as many of the Indian tribes have become.
In terms of bubble up, it's the opposite of trickle down. In the 60s, a lot of liberal commissions talked about big government programs from the top down, in which Washington had a lot of control. Conservatives like Gerald Ford in the mid-'70s talked about top-down programs as well, and said, well, a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that's just the opposite of bubble up. Jesse Jackson talked about bubble up, and he said, what about those boats stuck in the bottom in the mud? The idea is that instead of top-downing something, you have to facilitate people at the grassroots level to do it themselves, so it bubbles up. It's a very careful process by which resources are targeted from those who have the resources, but then the people who need them and who are indigenous to a community then have to take control, and it's an issue essentially of empowerment. Bubble up means those local people in inner city communities empowering themselves to do something. Yes.
I'd like to ask Mr. Williams if to explain and elaborate a little bit further on his comments about civic responsibility. It seems to me that in Massachusetts, for example, when we have such a difficult time of having people serve on jury duty, and we've had to change and reform the whole system in our own state, how he would see the civic responsibility in being involved in trying to assist the police in improving the climate against crime. And secondly, I'd like to ask Mr. Ginsburg if he could possibly look at our situation in Massachusetts regarding communities of Holyoke and Lawrence, where we have had some significant problems of rioting and arson, and I would like to submit to him that maybe the idea of extensive rioting in the 60s has changed, and it has become more localized in specific communities.
Well, it's not very complicated from my perspective. To have a democracy, you have to have participation. I've seen cities, I've seen Newark, where people didn't participate, did not go to governmental meetings like city council meetings and things of that nature. And the sort of things that were done in the name of the people was really, really terrible. And when you look at the crime problem, oftentimes people will not provide the police with information. They don't want to go to court. They don't want to be involved. To me, if we're going to have a republic, then people must be involved. In order to keep the politicians honest, you have to be involved. And in order to make the criminal justice system work right, people have to give information and they have to support the system.
I don't know what the situation is in Massachusetts, but I can readily understand that, just as Lynn was intimating, that crime itself is often an alternative response to rioting. It's, in a sense, individual rioting, and it's safer than riots. And I can well understand that there can be local riots, that is, local difficulty with smaller numbers of people. And it's not always the blacks. In a sense, the blacks and the Hispanics may represent threats to white structures, and the rioting may take place fundamentally on the part of the whites in particular situations.
Next question.
Yes, Mr. Curtis, I hear the same thing actually from all four of you except maybe Sister Fatah. And in particular, I'd ask you to say something about this. All of you seem to think that crime and rioting and everything, it all reduces to an economic problem, whether people have jobs and this kind of thing. And I think that certainly is an influence, but on the other hand, during the Depression years, as far as I know, there was a great deal less crime comparatively than there is today, and there was at least as much poverty, in fact, a great deal more than there is today. I think it's terribly simplified. This isn't really a question in that respect. I'd just like you to comment later. I think it's terribly simplified to look at all these problems that we're having in terms of simply, well, jobs and community networks and so on. I think there's a complete lack of moral sense in America, especially among the lower class, actually among the upper class too, if you look at what some business people do. And on top of that, there's a cult of violence, which you have to look at, I suppose, the newspapers, the TV, and so on. I come from Germany myself. I'm not even American, and I'm actually a little bit shocked by what I see here. And the violence that permeates the whole psychological atmosphere of the inner cities and so on is something which I wouldn't ascribe simply to people struggling against the injustice of society. I think it's just because they don't give a damn about other people. And for me, it's hard to understand how one person would go up and slug another and break his head open or something, take $5 off him. That doesn't have a lot to do with the fact that he hasn't got a job. I think it has more to do with the fact that he has no respect for other people's lives. We have poverty in Europe as well, and yet we have much less crime. And that's true of almost any country. I lived in Canada for a long time, which is why I speak this language. I think you're looking for the solutions, or the whole analysis of the problem is going in the wrong direction. I think your problem is a question of morality, and it's a question of your cultural approach towards aggression and things like that. Would you want to comment on that?
I'll say a little, but that's something that we can all talk about for a couple of hours. I would simply say that, of course, we're not really using simplified notions like poverty. And you're talking about relative deprivation. You're talking, for example, about what a young man in Harlem sees on Park Avenue, and not something that simply reflects a low income level. When you talk about values, wow, it's Edwin Banfield, The Unheavenly City, immediate and deferred gratification. Lots of big debates have been on that over the years. It's a very sensitive area when you say that there's a lower class value system that's responsible for this. I think I'd like to turn it over to Sister Falaka if she has any comments, especially about lower class values and how they're morally corrupt.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Well, I'd like to stress it.
Okay. We had a gang conference where we brought together leaders of 80 gangs in Philadelphia. And the reason for the conference was to discuss the issue of gang violence, murder. And one of the things that we found when we began the process of the discussion was we began with black people being murdered. You know, being murdered brought here in the Middle Passage, being murdered during the period of lynching, being murdered just casually, and, you know, the inadequate sentencing if a black person is killed. You know, we brought this all the way down to the point, well, if black people now kill each other, then we have now accepted the value that white people used to put on a black life. And when the themes began to be understood by these young men who had not looked at it in that light, They didn't realize that they were now doing the oppressor's work. Then the conversation shifted to the one word, respect. When we talked to them about why were you out there in the street, what is it that you're trying to prove? You know, somebody told them that manhood, machoism, was related to respect. So I don't think we're talking about, a culture of violence or pathology. I think we're talking about learned behavior based on the value system of this country. But you have to remember that this country, in its original state, was founded by ex-convicts. Okay? So I think we need to, in terms of dealing with the question of crime and violence, whether it's on an individual basis or a collective basis, we need to look at whether or not people feel a responsibility to a higher being, whether or not anyone has a right to take another person's life, because that is the theme that eventually hit home among these young people, that they did not have the right, regardless, to take another person's life. And that's when they start talking about how do you live without committing murder.
Yeah, I'd like to make a few comments. Number one, you shouldn't generalize that the way you did, and saying that we all were talking about crime, rioting, and jobs as a solution. Because I clearly never said anything like that, so I really don't know how you got the impression. And secondly, the notion that I think Sister Fatah has talked sufficiently about this business of moral values as a class kind of thing, so that I shouldn't really have to comment on that, because I know that the Roman culture in those days, they thought that they were a moral culture as well. Everyone that was in charge was moral, and those people that they were oppressing lacked morality. But I wonder too, whether or not in your remarks I sense a kind of European bias, and I wonder whether or not the Turkish problem that you have there in Germany, how that problem is dealing. What do you feel about the morality with respect to the way Germans are dealing with the Turkish problem, or the morality with respect to the way the French are dealing with the Arab problem, or the morality with respect to the way the English are dealing with the West Indian problem? I think that what we see is when people in power are dealing with people that are different in some ways, we end up with problems of the same